Hello, folks. I'm David Brewster, and this is a Post Alley Zoomcast from our news Zoom, so to speak. I'm coming to you from my home in Madrona, and I'd like to introduce Michael Lewis, who is coming to us from Medina. He is the founder and editor of a new data analytical site called Puget Sound Indexer. And many of his articles appear there, and some of them also appear on Post Alley. And our special guest is Jonathan Scholes, and he is the president and CEO of Downtown Seattle Association, which is a leading business organization that covers a broad conception of downtown, including parts of Capitol Hill and to Lower Queen Anne, as well as downtown proper, Belltown, and down to Pioneer Square in the International District. And our subject today is what's happening to downtown. And obviously, it's one of the hardest hit by the pandemic. And so we're going to explore with John how to get out of this and some other things which are happening there. I thought, John, if we might start, I would just ask you, since you're in the heart of the eye of the storm of all of these factors like that, what was your day like today? Who all were you talking with, and how many emergency vehicles did you have to send out to these folks?
Yeah, well, let's see. Gosh, it's hard to even think what I had for breakfast, but let me go back. I joined a press conference with a number of local leaders around the challenges that the Washington State Convention Center is facing in their expansion project and the financing challenges and the need for some federal investment to keep that project moving so it doesn't have to shut down in 10 months. So we held a Zoom virtual press conference that went well and had great participation from some local media. Our senior team at the DSA is meeting on Zoom each and every day at 10:30. So we had our regular call, and we're planning for our next fiscal year and our budget, which starts in July, and trying to understand what the world is going to look like over the next 12 months and how it impacts our finances. And we're supported through membership dues and sponsorships, and also property assessments that the downtown property owners pay. So we're trying to understand what potential shortfalls there may be in our sources of income and plan accordingly. I've been serving on the mayor's small business advisory task force that she pulled together in response to the economic impacts to Seattle from the coronavirus. And we had a meeting today of that group and talked through some of the issues that they're focused on. And then we've been coordinating among the other business improvement associations in the city of Seattle. So Ballard and Soto in the U District, and we have a regular call each week. So I was on the phone with my peers in some of those other neighborhoods because they've got similar organizations to the Downtown Seattle Association in each of those neighborhoods. So a variety of conversations and meetings, all virtually, of course, all mostly through Zoom.
And there we're joined by Kathy Cain, who is another writer in Post Alley and a writer in town, and she's calling in from Waitsburg in Eastern Washington, and hence the beautiful tree behind there. And Kathy, you probably want to unmute and be able to join the conversation. So John.
Sorry, I will unmute.
Okay, there she is. John, so you're talking about next year and planning for that and your budget and so forth. Tell us a little bit about what next year looks like. Obviously, Seattle, goes through Boeing busts and so forth. It's not totally unfamiliar with these air pockets in the local economy, but this is pretty extreme. So what are you seeing for the association and for the constituent businesses in next year?
A very difficult year, and I think this is going to be a long, slow climb back to anywhere near normal, multi-year recovery. We've never seen anything quite like this as far as the severe and sudden economic impacts that we faced across sectors in downtown. And downtown is really the first urban area in the country to feel the economic effects of the coronavirus. And we felt them really early on in March, well before restaurants and retailers were ordered to be closed. It really started when folks were advised to work from home on March 5th. And we saw downtown empty out in a lot of ways. And the sidewalks got quiet, the hotel lobbies, the restaurants, the retailers, everything got quiet real fast in those first few days following the March 5th recommendations from the governor. Our unemployment is at 60,000 plus jobs lost over the last couple of months. And to put that in comparison, we lost about 28,000 during the Great Recession in downtown. And those were lost over the course of a couple of years. And we've lost twice that over the course of just a couple of months. So we've never faced anything quite like this, either locally or nationally. We've got unemployment nationally approaching 20%. And I think at the height of the Great Depression, it was 24.5% unemployment. So this is a really deep hole. And I don't think there's a quick bounce back. I wish there was, but I think we have to face up to the reality ahead and the challenges. And, some of the industries that were affected first, arts and culture and conventions and hotels, are going to be some of the last to recover. And those are industries that are anchored in our downtowns and in our urban cores. And they've got a real tough road ahead. So there's not a rosy way to look at this. It's going to be difficult. And I think in a lot of ways, the recovery is going to kind of come from the outside of metro areas inward. And the inner cores are going to be some of the last areas to really fully recover. And that's going to be a challenge.
Oh. Michael, you are working on a story that I looked at earlier today about the end of urbanism and how, the key to urban productivity is density and closeness and sharing spaces. And that's going to be suspended for quite a while. Why don't you talk a little bit about your thinking about that? And then I also wanted to ask you what's happening in downtown Bellevue.
Well, you summed it up. I think the kind of the coolest definition of urbanism is the absence of space between people and businesses. And that gives rise to what economists call agglomeration economics, which is kind of a fancy way of saying all the good things that happen when you just bump into people. When you're surrounded by people who do the kinds of things you do, and you learn from them and you share ideas and figure out different ways to do things. And that's all good. And it happens, with more density, you get more of that. Excuse me. One of the things that's really interesting here is, urban economics has a very well-established sort of framework for how people decide where they want to live. And it's a combination of what they can earn, the amenities surrounding them, and what it costs. And then the interplay between those three things is very well established. Well, suddenly we've just introduced a fourth one, which is safety. And no one has any idea what to do with this. It's never really been a factor. And so you can see this playing out in a lot of different ways, but nobody knows quite how, because you can't weight those things in a way that sort of you sort of forecast people's behavior. So that's going to be a very strange thing going forward. And the other thing I think is, one of the sort of basic principles in behavioral economics is very important here, is that people, when they make decisions in their life, they tend to place a lot more weight on the negative than the positive, much more weight on the things they fear than on the things they hope for. And so it's sort of like you could put all of the good things about a city and urban life on one side of a scale, and fear of infectious disease on the other side, and the infectious disease is going to win. And you just can't sort of beat a negative with a positive. I learned that in political work a long time ago. You got to really deal with that negative. So that's why it's so important, that we make progress on vaccinations and treatments, so we can sort of credibly deal with those negatives. Then we can sort of return to selling the positives, because otherwise people just won't be listening.
Let me also ask about what's happening in downtown Bellevue. Is that the same as downtown Seattle? And you were mentioning in the draft of the article, there's a lot of Chinese investment in Bellevue that might be jeopardized by this and other factors.
Well, Bellevue is a really different place. John probably knows more about than I do, the sort of the intricacies of the downtown. It faces many of the same things that downtown Seattle does. Very dependent on business travel, which is sort of dried up, even more so than downtown Seattle. A lot of telecommuting. So, businesses there are very stable, but everybody can work from home. So there's, all the restaurants will face the same kinds of pressures in there. I think both downtown Seattle and downtown Bellevue face the same problem of public transit and people's willingness to take transit. Bellevue isn't as dependent as downtown Seattle on transit, but it's still getting pretty dependent. So I don't know that Bellevue is in necessarily a whole lot better shape than downtown Seattle. There's less independent retail and restaurants and that sort of thing. So the deep pocketed chains will probably be able to hang in there a little bit more. But I think sort of as you look out into the future, it's really important to look at places even further out, sort of Redmond, Issaquah, south parts of Bellevue, where they can remain auto dependent and still sort of get away with it in a way that the closer in places can't. As far as, offshore money, yeah, there's a lot of it in being invested in Bellevue. And Bellevue's just got this, enormous Chinese population to begin with, and a lot of the investments coming there. And so where that goes and how much that sticks, there's already, a couple of big projects that I think have stalled out. So that'll be a big factor going forward.
John, I wanted to ask you, since a lot of Seattle's employment, particularly downtown, is in the tech sector, and the tech sector can operate at distance probably better than making airplanes. Are we going to be somewhat cushioned from the impact of that because it's going to be so easy for a significant part of our economy to work at distance in like Waitsburg?
Yeah, I think to some extent, yes, but there's no doubt that we've got sectors that have been deeply impacted in downtown, throughout the city, throughout the region, that are going to be hurt for some time. And whether that's aerospace or hospitality, arts and culture, those folks are hurting dramatically and may be for some time. And we have other sectors, biotech, technology, and healthcare down the road. I mean, healthcare has certainly been impacted over the last several months, but I think we can sort of foresee a recovery there once elective surgeries and procedures are allowed. So those will insulate us, I think, at a macro level, but I think we've got a number of sectors in our community that are going to be deeply affected.
If I could just jump in here real quick, David, looking through the occupational data on unemployment filings, what you started to see, about a month after you saw this big bulge in people from the hospitality industry, you started to see a big bulge in applications from people in sort of management and office kinds of positions. And if you think about it, if the restaurants aren't open, then the restaurant supply places aren't open. If construction sites are shut down, not only the suppliers, but the engineers and all these people who serve the construction industry aren't working. So there's this cascading that's happened sort of back upstream from kind of the consumer businesses that closed first.
Okay, Kathy, are you able to hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you, and I think I've stopped being bounced off, so I think I'm going to be here for a while.
Okay. So the question I wanted to bring back the arts, and I know you're very concerned about that. And the other is the kind of silver lining question, and that is, as rents come down because of the lack of demand and the need to fill up spaces like that, are we likely to recapture in our downtown the kinds of places that Kathy, modest rent, individualized retail and restaurants? And I know Kathy and I were talking about that, and I hold out that hope that the Seattle of Bernie Utz hats can.
You broke up a little there, David. I didn't quite get the end of the question, but I think I got a sense of where you're going around just the opportunities on the ground floor if demand and prices come down. I mean, I think it's already happening where landlords and the ground floor tenants, whether they be restaurants or retailers, are having have those tough conversations of how to restructure their leases. And I think landlords understand the value of what's at the ground floor to the overall experience and vibrancy in downtown, and to their own asset and the interest that their tenants upstairs, if they've got an office building or a residential building, have in a quality ground floor tenant and experience. And we were already seeing a number of commercial developers really understand those economics, and that it maybe didn't make so much sense to try to squeeze every dime out of your per square foot rent on the ground floor, and that you could instead think about what's most valuable that you could create there, and maybe in some ways subsidize that rent, and it helps drive the economics upstairs. And you saw that in a couple of recent projects. I think the Talon project at 8th and Olive, where they brought in Mr. West, a great wine shop in Madrona that then opened a second location in downtown. And they were really thoughtful about creating a unique experience there, which could have been lots of different things. So I think that's going to accelerate, and it's already starting to happen, because, you know, the office owners want to keep those tenants they have, and they want that ground floor to be interesting and active, and they want to help those small businesses get through this. And I think that trend is just going to accelerate over the next year or two. And the lenders are a part of this too, obviously. But it really ultimately comes down to the tenant and those landlords. And I think we have some smart and forward thinking and thoughtful landlords that care about the vibrancy of downtown. And they know that emptying that out to make a few extra bucks is not in the long-term interest of their asset or the downtown itself.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in. I'm really glad to hear you say that, John, because my fantasy as someone who doesn't do development is that downtown building owners will see those street level tenants as assets instead of revenue sources. Because, I mean, as little as I know about economics, it just doesn't make sense to have those guys pay the big money when you've got 13 or 40 floors above you that can help do that. And if you do depend on those people, then the streetscape just becomes long walls of Macy's or Nordstrom. And I shop downtown a lot, but I never hang out downtown because there just aren't enough places there that I feel great hanging out in. I go to the market or I go down to Pioneer Square. But I remember a day when there were more of those. So that's good to know, because that's exactly what I was going to come and talk to you about, is that I would love to see landlords and developers look at street level retail as something they subsidize and something that will make their tenants happy. You know, people who come to work in those office buildings don't want to all go to chains. There's nothing wrong with Starbucks if you like Starbucks, but if you're one of those people that wants something different, that should be available in downtown. One of the things that I wrote a little tribute to Cafe Paloma at Post Alley, but one of the things downtown that broke my heart was, I don't know if you remember M. Coy Books. About 8 years ago, they left because the rent was killing them. They just couldn't make any money. And that space was empty for 8 years, and nobody wins there, right? So I would just love to see a little more flexibility in downtown, that kind of thing, because it's going to be good for business, both building owners and developers, as well as the people who come downtown. So that's good to hear. Yeah,
and I think in a lot of ways, this crisis, this economic crisis, this health crisis, and the way it's impacted urban areas and cities like ours, it gives us sort of an opportunity to reboot and reset, and to deal with some of the problems that we went into this crisis with, whether it's affordability on the commercial side and retailers and the ground floor challenges, or housing affordability and how we got to the point we were in Seattle around that issue, or homelessness. We sort of have this opportunity to reboot and reset the approach, and to learn from the past mistakes of the last 10 or 20 years, and to do things differently. And we have a little bit more breathing room now, because the demand and the pressure isn't there, unfortunately. We'd all want it to return, but it's going to be a few years. So I think we have the opportunity to do things differently, and to learn from the mistakes of the last 20 years and how urban areas have developed around the US.
Yeah, that's what's great about this reset, even though it's tragic, is that you don't have to wait over the period of time that it takes people to gradually get it that this isn't working. I love the fact that we now have this snap reboot, and now let's try something new. And the whole change could happen faster. And I would love to see it go back more to a mixed use thing. Underlying
this discussion is the fact that Seattle rents were too high, and you can see that in the arts sector and in the small shop sector and living and even renting office space. So my question, John, to you is, a year from now, how much will rents across the board be lower?
Well, it depends on what kind of rents you're talking about, whether it's residential, retail, or office, but I think they're all coming down to some degree. I think office is going to be somewhat insulated because I think you're going to have some projects that maybe were going to get built that don't. So we're going to have some restriction in new supply. So if you're the owner of an existing building, there's going to be some advantage there. And we do have that insulation of some sectors that we're pleased to have in Seattle that are a bit more insulated from the economic impacts than others that are office users. I do believe we're going to have a lot of people continue to work from home over the next year plus. Those that can, I think, will, and that's going to be encouraged not just from the employer, but from public health officials. So those offices may be less crowded over a longer period of time here. But I think overall that sector is going to be okay. I think residential rents, we're looking at numbers of down 7% by the end of this year. And I think retail has not shown a decline yet, but I think retail will come down a bit as well. I mean, it's very likely.
Yeah. So one last area, and this is again a possible benefit of this shock to the system, and that is a different way of thinking about homeless. And I think one of the things as homeless as an issue shifts from a kind of civil rights perspective or lens to a public health perspective, I think that we're seeing that warehousing the homeless, allowing them to be in encampments and so forth, is not only a health problem, but is not enabling people to get out of homeless. And so I think that there might be a shift to a better system. Tiny houses is sometimes mentioned as something that has a better success rate and also might be better from a public health point of view. But I know you're very concerned about what to do about homeless in downtown Seattle. And do you see a shift here that might be beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, already in the last month and a half, we've done some things in Seattle and King County that would have taken years to do before. For example, reducing the number of people in the Morrison Hotel at 3rd and Yesler that is run by the Downtown Emergency Service Center, and allowing some of those folks to move into single rooms in a Red Lion and Renton. And so looking at this model of congregate shelter and saying, is this the right approach? And putting a bunch of people in a really crowded environment that frankly isn't that healthy in good times for them, is there a better way? And the county, to their credit, and DESC moved quickly. And I question, and I think they do as well, do we need to go back? Should we go back to crowding all those people back into Morrison? Or can we get better outcomes for them and the surrounding community, frankly, if we look at a different model? And then the other thing I'd add is, just as we've seen the challenges of, local and state governments responding to the public health threat of this virus and the importance of needing federal leadership and federal resources and investments on things like testing and other interventions for us to collectively flatten the curve and see the progress we need to. We've sort of left the federal government off the hook in their response to homelessness over the last decade. And we've put all the burden on local governments and the resources that they have. And I just think it's not a model that's going to work. We've shown that it's not going to work, and that local government can only do so much here over the last decade, whether you're in San Francisco, Seattle, or New York. And so just as we need strong federal leadership to respond to this pandemic, we need strong federal leadership to respond to the public health crisis we had going into this pandemic, which is homelessness. And so I hope we can inspire our federal leaders to take some more significant action than what they've done in the last decade on this issue.
I'm not sure what federal government you're referring to, but I take the point. Thank you very much for watching us, and thank you, Kathy and Michael, for your contributions to Post Alley and this discussion. And thank you very much, John, for the enlightenment and that hot seat where you find yourself. Seattle has long dreamed about a vibrant, interesting, creative downtown. It's you know, the many years that I've been writing about Seattle, that's always been a core value, particularly the retail part of downtown. And I agree that there is a reset here that might get back to something that is a little more characterful and distinctive about our downtown. And I hope we can make it without too many casualties. Thank you very much for joining us for this Zoomcast. Keep reading Post Alley and keep helping your local restaurants.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.
Bye.